Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 37 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin, and that is Mike. Today we're doing things a little different, Mike, because one of us has had some particularly exciting life things happen and couldn't prepare a proper podcast episode.
Yeah, have you gone surfing yet? Like, what's the current status? How
I,
California are you?
I have not gone surfing yet, although I have had a new friend offer to teach me. So,
Really? You're already making friends?
yes. So, if anybody's not catching on to what's happening here, I recently moved to California from New York. I travel across the entire continent of North America. Um, it took about 43 hours and was just a touch under 3,000 miles. But with only a few check engine light scares happening along the way, I arrived in one piece. And yeah, so with that said, I did not have time to properly plan an episode. So, conveniently, we're going to be doing another Mike Takes the Wheel episode today. And I have literally no idea what we're talking about today, so I'm very excited. Before we get into that, let's talk about this day in history instead of science, as we do with these
Yeah.
episodes.
Well, we can do that. I think we had two of them picked out. So we had one for the day we're recording, which is August 24th. And you had the one for that, which is, kind of science related and history related, kind of a mashup of things. And then I have another one for the day this episode comes out on August 25th. That will sort of launch us into what it is that we're talking about today. So why don't you go ahead? We're recording this on August 24th. In both of our time zones, it is still the same date. So what?
Right.
Yeah. So what do you got?
So, on this day, August 24th, in 79 AD, the volcano Mount Vesuvius erupted. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's the volcano that buried Pompeii, along with another city called Herculaneum, which I did
Ooh,
not know.
I did not know there was
You,
another city
you,
involved.
yeah, you always just hear about Pompeii, but apparently there's another city called Herculaneum nearby that also got buried this way. So they
Oh,
got buried in, like I said, 79 AD, and were basically just kind of forgotten about. Like the people in like nearby towns were like, well, guess they're gone. Um, and then were rediscovered in the 1700s by archaeologists. So
did you read the I believe it was called Magic Treehouse books growing up?
I did. I don't remember if I read the Pompeii one though.
I'm
I don't believe
almost
so.
I'm almost certain we had one of those in our house, and I remember the Magic Treehouse books. For those who don't remember, to be honest, I mostly don't
They're
remember
kind
them,
of a
but
fever dream from childhood, if I'm being honest.
yeah, it was like these kids would go to this treehouse, and then they'd get transported back to different events in history. It was kind of historical fiction.
Right.
I think kind of like Wishbone, if I remember correctly.
I want to
The
say it
TV show.
was, yeah, similar to that, but in my mind the closest thing that I sort of related to is the Magic School Bus.
That's another perfect
So I
perfect
think
example.
it's like to history what the Magic School Bus was to like science.
I think that's a perfect way to look at it. And so, yeah, that'll be most of the science that we go over today. But yeah, just kind of a yesterday in history for those of you that are listening to this.
Yeah.
Um, and for me, what I have, so the day this comes out on August 25th, for those of you that are listening on that Wednesday it comes out, in 1932, Amelia Earhart completed her first transcontinental
Ooh.
flight. And it was the first solo nonstop flight by a woman in the United States. And that was, 1932. So people hadn't been, flying across, the country all that long. Um, and so that
Yeah.
kind of, yeah. And so Amelia Earhart is kind of everybody's heard her name before. And she sort of fills this dual role of kind of women in history. And often when we talk about women in history, we're talking about like the first woman to do a thing. And I'm always a little bit like on edge with that because I want to celebrate just like women who do things just because they were cool things and less about whether or not they were the first person to do something. Um,
Right.
right, because there's it is very important to celebrate the progress that women have made, and the first woman to do X thing is always an important thing to celebrate. But I also think it's really important to say women can be notable for things that are not being the first woman to do something. Um, And so today we get to kind of talk about somebody else that fulfills both of those roles.
Okay. Hit me.
And
Who we
so,
got?
well, before I get there, we're going to do
Okay. All
this is
right.
going to
All
be
right.
a woman in United States politics. And I'm going to ask you, are there any particular names that come to your mind when we're talking about women in United States politics? I've got a number jotted down here.
Can you
Um,
give me a time frame, or is that
at
not
any
allowed?
point, at any point in U.S. history, I'm talking specifically like office holders. So I've got a list of kind of
Okay.
like first office holders of various types in U.S. history among women. Obviously, as of this recording, there has never been a woman president,
Mm-hmm.
but just about every other position has been filled in one way or the other, except for like Secretary of War slash Secretary of Defense is one of the only cabinet positions that has never been filled by a woman. But what do you got for first woman that have filled different positions in U.S. history?
The first one that comes to my mind is, I believe her name is Madeleine Albright.
First woman Secretary of State during the Bill Clinton administration. Yes, I didn't even have that one
Yes.
written down, but yes, that's a wonderful one to point out.
Um. So presumably we're talking older than that.
The person I'm going to get to is older than that. I will tell you right now, you will not know this person
Okay.
that I'm going to bring up. I'm just like in general, some notable women first that you can think of. It's harder than you think, isn't it?
It is. It is quite hard because it's like
Yeah.
obviously we know we currently have the first woman vice president that we have had.
Yep. There we go. Kamala
Um.
Harris, who was inaugurated as vice president on January 20th of this year.
Um.
Do you know who the first
Was
woman Speaker of the House is?
was it Nancy Pelosi?
Nancy Pelosi was the first and to
The
date
the first
only.
time that she was speaker, yeah.
Correct. Yeah, she is to date the only woman Speaker of the House. In 2007 is when she first got that title.
But
Do you
yeah,
know the
other
first woman
other than
Supreme Court
that,
justice?
well, it's Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right?
It is not Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Oh.
Very common misconception. In 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor, appointed by
Okay. Yeah.
President Reagan, became the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. I believe she got in with a unanimous vote or something very close to it. Um, and it's one of those things. As I was kind of going through this, and every couple of months, I kind of revisit this idea. Kind of women first in American politics, they're
Hmm.
just not as famous as you would think. The first woman to do X thing. So we've got, for example, a woman named Rebecca Felton became the first U.S. senator in 1922 for one day. Um, it was kind of an odd situation that was going on there. She wound up being appointed there, and she was the only female senator from Georgia until Kelly Loeffler in 2020.
Yes.
Yeah, so it
Kelly
took
Loeffler.
it took 98 years for Georgia to have a female senator last longer than one day.
And she only
Um,
lasted a year.
right. It was an interesting situation with her as well. The first
Georgia
person that was
Georgia
actually
senatorial elections are very odd anyway.
yeah, we're actually going to talk about sort of an interesting election. We're not going to get too deep into it, but that's part of
Okay.
what we're going to talk about today. The first person actually elected in senator was a woman named Hattie Cardaway.
Okay.
Nellie Tilrow Ross, and I'm old timey names. I'm going to do the best I can. And that one's not even all that bad. But
Right.
she became the first woman governor in 1925.
Hmm.
Frances Perkins was the first U.S. cabinet secretary, began serving in 1933 as Secretary of Labor under the Franklin Roosevelt administration.
Hmm.
Um, and so all of these are interesting, notable people. And then I also have Sandra Day O'Connor, Nancy Pelosi, Kamala Harris. Um, all of these people, every last one of them, comes after a very kind of seminal piece of, I don't want to even call it legislation, but a really important thing that happened in American history that relates to women. Do you think you know what I'm talking about?
I believe you're referring to the 19th Amendment.
Correct. And for all of our non-US listeners out there, the 19th Amendment, do you know what it does?
Yes, it gives women, although I believe at this time it's still white women, pretty much, the right to vote.
Um so
Oh well,
the
if effectively.
yes, so there was it is more. It is complicated. The 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote regardless of skin color. The 19th Amendment guarantees the right to vote regardless of sex. Now, there are still many laws that try to get around specifically the racial component to that. And so, that battle goes on, depending on who you talk to until the 60s or until today. Um, and that's a certainly a separate discussion.
Right.
Um, One thing I do want to point out is that there was actually there's sort of a misconception that women could not vote until the 19th Amendment. That's actually not true for quite a lot of the country. There were many states and territories in the U.S. that actually allowed women to vote by 1920.
Interesting.
Uh,
I
yeah,
definitely, that sounds like something that like maybe like my high school history teacher like mentioned offhandedly.
right.
I would wager that, being educated in New York, New York was not one of the states that allowed that. Otherwise, we would have learned about it. Plus, that's where a significant amount of the like protests and things like that for like Seneca Falls is in New
hmm
York State.
Yeah, so
Um,
New York, it was 3 years before. So I actually remember going to vote in
okay,
New York back in 2017. They were giving out the stickers they gave out were like 100-year anniversary of
interesting.
when women got the right to vote to New York. So New York was 1917, a couple of years before. The very first state to give women the right to vote was Wyoming in 1890.
Wyoming
So
was a
again,
state in 1890.
yeah, Wyoming was, and I believe I don't know this for sure, but I believe part of the rationale for Wyoming, to help them become a state was,
There
or
were so
to
few
part of the
people that
rationale,
they had to count women.
if so few people they had to count women, and that was
Yep.
able to boost their population. I am not 100% sure on that, but I believe I've heard that
Interesting.
before.
I mean, it would
Um,
make sense. I mean, I believe
yeah,
even including Alaska, it's the least populated state today.
yeah, Wyoming. There's nobody living there.
I've
Um,
been there, and I've been there a couple times actually, and I can confirm that.
It's also, it's not the largest state, but it's like a reasonably large
It's
state, and there's
very
right. It's
big.
just so loosely, densely populated
Right.
in addition to everything else. So, um, and so I bring up all of that, all of the kind of the women first of history, and then sort of that line of demarcation in 1920, where women were guaranteed the right to vote, and not just women, but people regardless of sex. And I don't want to lose track of of people that are neither male nor female in this conversation. The
Right.
19th
Yeah.
Amendment
Of course.
actually is written. You are allowed to vote regardless of sex. Is the language that is used, which is important language for today's day and age.
Right.
However, the person we're going to talk about actually comes along and completes her feat. Let me rephrase that. Becomes the first woman to do the thing before the 19th Amendment is actually ratified.
Hmm.
And so I mentioned senators and governors and Speaker of the House and Supreme Court Justice and Vice and all that. Do you have any guess as to what position the person that we're going to be talking about today actually came from, or what she actually served in?
So there's one key part of large scale American government that you haven't mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, tangentially mentioned with the Speaker of the House, but I don't think you
Yes,
mentioned
you're on the
anything
right track
about
here.
the rest of Congress by itself, or the House of
Exactly.
Representatives proper.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the House of Representatives, the lower house of the United States government. And today we're going to be looking at a woman that serves 2 terms in Congress, a woman named Jeannette Rankin, who becomes the first woman in the House of Representatives in the year 1917 from the state of Montana. And
A
what
quick
ends
a
up
quick
happening,
pause here for a second. This is
yeah, absolutely.
I really doubt that they're at all related. Although given how small the like upper Midwest in like the Montana and Dakotas area is, I wouldn't be surprised. So the
Hmm.
president of my graduate school that I went to, the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, his last name is Rankin. Fun fact.
Really?
Yes.
Huh.
Um
I would have to
so
imagine there's a connection somewhere going back far enough up the tree.
right, that'd be really that's really neat though. Interesting.
It is really cool. And this, as I mentioned, uh, you know, Jeanette Rankin she is really interesting. Both she is the first woman to serve, in the federal government in any elected position, which is notable in itself. And then we're going to get to what makes her, I think, more interesting and what quite possibly actually outpaces her legacy. I would wager a guess you've never heard the name, or at the very least, it hasn't stuck in your head. Jeanette Rankin up until this
No.
point.
Nope,
Right,
not at
exactly.
all.
right, first woman, and just, it just doesn't stick. It's not a name that people know. And so we're going to kind of tell her story, her life story. Or I shouldn't say her public life story, I guess I should say. She ran in 1917 as a progressive Republican. Now, when you hear Republican, don't think of today's Republican Party.
Right.
This is sort of the era of, this is, slightly past Teddy Roosevelt's time, but Teddy Roosevelt, that kind of, trust busting, progressive style Republicans that
Mm-hmm.
were big believers in labor unions and things of that sort. And when she ran on a program of social welfare, again, with that progressive movement,
Mm-hmm.
women's suffrage, shocker,
Okay.
as well as prohibition. We were, as she was running, the country was about ready
Mm-hmm.
to pass a constitutional amendment banning the sale and consumption of alcohol. And the way elections worked in Montana, this was the last time they actually did this. But what it was is that Montana had two congressional districts. And instead of just splitting the state up into two districts, they give everybody in Montana one vote, and the top two people would get elected. And so the Democrats ran two people, the Republicans ran two people, and the Socialists also ran two people. And so in the 1916 election, so right before
Mm-hmm.
the election takes place in 1916, and then
Right.
you
Yeah.
take office the following year, the Democrat, John Means, who was the incumbent, was elected with 26% of the vote. Tom Stout, a Democrat, did not run for reelection. And just barely edging out by only a couple of percentage points, Harry Mitchell, was Jeannette Rankin. She won 24% of the vote. She finished in second, which meant that she won that second seat from Montana's at-large congressional district.
Hmm.
And she went to serve, I believe it was March 4th was when she took office in 1917. Now, as she takes office in 1917. Now, Gavin, you are, a smart man. History is not your thing, but you're a smart man. She takes
Thank
office
you.
in 1917. Do you have any guess as to what um, something that was really important at that time?
World War One.
World War I, exactly. And this is where we start to get into what I would wager, and what I would argue she's actually more known for and more notable for.
Okay.
And we'll see this story unfold over the as we're going through this podcast. She was concerned with many issues. One was kind of feminism and women's suffrage, but the other was pacifism. Jeannette Rankin was incredibly anti-war in any circumstance, and I do mean that.
Hmm.
And so, as I'm talking about this, World War One, the way it gets talked about in U.S. history classes can be a bit of a misnomer. You may hear about things like the Zimmerman telegram, and
Yep.
the sinking of the
Sure did.
Lusitania,
Yep. Sure
if
did.
that comes to mind. Um, there was not a single event that brought the United States into World War One. It was sort of this
Right.
slow drumbeat that eventually just kind of reached a point where enough votes were given to actually have the United States go to war. Woodrow Wilson kind of famously ran in 1916 on the slogan, he kept us out of the war. He got reelected, and then within a year, the United States was in World War One.
Hmm.
And eventually that came up for a vote in the United States. Congress has the power to declare war, and there were 50 votes cast in opposition to World War one of which was Jeannette Rankin. There were also 6 votes cast against going into World War One in the Senate,
Oh,
and
so
she said,
quick
"Yeah,
question.
yeah."
How many members of each body were
Oh,
there
that's a
at the
good
time?
question. I wrote down something else, but let me pull up the actual vote. So if I pull up the vote, so it was in the Senate it passed 82-6,
Okay.
and in the House of Representatives the vote passed 373-50.
Okay.
So it is we have numbers that are reasonably close to where they are today.
Gotcha. Which
And there
makes
may
sense. It
well
wasn't a lot of the states were added in like the late 1800s or so.
Right, exactly. So there wasn't a whole lot left. And so at that point, so there was again, 6 male senators that voted against war and 49 male senators that voted again, or 49 male members of the House of Representatives that voted against war. But Jeannette Rankin was the only woman, and she kind of bore the brunt of kind of the anti-war, and people that really did want to go to war singled her out. Um, all that, and the quote she gave when asked to talk about that was, she went on to say, "I felt the first time that a woman had a chance to say no to war, she should say it."
Hmm.
She felt really strongly that her as a woman should have a strong voice against war, against not going to war. And she was not alone in doing this. She was one of dozens of members of Congress at that point to vote against going to war, but she really made a name for herself, being the first woman in Congress to go ahead and do that, which is kind of remarkable that the first woman in Congress, um, serving in that very first term, she winds up casting a vote against going to World War One. That's sort of a happy accident of history or happy coincidence. Regardless of how you feel about that particular vote, it is kind of an interesting thing that happens. That was not the only thing she did during that first term, though. She worked to improve some working conditions, encouraging the Treasury Secretary at the time to shorten the workday to 8 hours. And she helped start debate on some language that would eventually, after she was done serving in Congress, go on to become that 19th Amendment. So that, in her first time, she was not just there as a placeholder. She was not there, um, you know, just to serve as the first woman senator, but not do much. She really
Mm-hmm.
did try and do a lot of good work. As I mentioned, the Montana changed its congressional election system after Rankin first won, and she knew the district that she got redistricted into was a very Democratic district, and she had virtually no shot of winning her seat back in Congress after that first term.
So, and maybe you're getting to this.
Hmm.
Um, do we think that that was a coincidence?
So I can't tell. It wouldn't surprise me if that was specifically done to keep a woman out of Congress. Um, but it's also like looking at the way Montana used to do elections, and this being kind of a thing that I look at a lot. Like
Mm-hmm.
the way they used to do elections was really bad. It was
Right.
just a
Yeah.
very
Like
poor
as you were
system.
describing it, it sounded. I'm like, why on earth would they ever do that?
Yeah, it's a really poor system, and so I couldn't say for sure this was done just to keep a woman out of Congress. I can say it's definitely worth asking that question, and oh boy, I wouldn't be surprised.
Well, not just
But there
that,
was
but
definitely
like,
some,
oh,
yeah.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say there's some facial plausibility to wanting to get rid of that system while also recognizing the effect that it had.
Right. And so I don't know when. Obviously, they did not even have computers at this point, but
Right.
by a long shot. Um, but when did sort of the practice of like modern esque gerrymandering sort of happen?
So funny story. So going back to, are you familiar with a man named Elbridge Gerry?
I know this is the person that gerrymandering is named after, well, misnamed after.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Well,
but
the
other than
mispronounced
that,
after.
no.
Yeah. So he was an American founding father. He served, I believe he served in Congress, and he served briefly as vice president
Oh,
for
interesting.
either Jefferson or Madison. He dies in office actually.
As vice president,
As vice president, he dies in office.
wild.
Yeah, and part of the reason why, the reason why this is called the practice of drawing congressional districts to, you know, to favor one party or another, is called gerrymandering, is because of Elbridge Gerry,
Mm-hmm.
um, and what he did, I believe, as governor of Pennsylvania to
Okay.
draw congressional districts, and it's called the gerrymander because one of the districts was kind of drawn, and people said it looked like a salamander.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Gerrymandering in the process of kind of very creatively drawing congressional districts has gone on for a while.
Okay.
With increasing in, increases in computer power, that has gone on to further extremes.
Okay.
Um,
Because obviously, if she were to be running in that district, she would have to live there, and I assume that that was a rule even back then.
yeah, that
So
was what happened, is that she was in
was
one
she
district,
like
and I mean,
well within that district, or was it like sort of conveniently around where she lived?
I
Do
cannot
you know that,
find.
or okay?
I'm not exactly sure where it was. I do know, again, with Montana at this time, they had two congressional districts, so there's only so creative you can get with
Right.
that. So again, it is one of those things where I don't want to totally throw everybody under the bus, at this time because I don't have enough information. It's damn convenient that this was done right after she was elected. However, there would be good reasons, absent any of this, to want to get rid of this system.
Gotcha. That makes
But
sense.
anyways, so through some unfortunate circumstances, Rankin knew she wouldn't be able to win that seat back after that one term in Congress. She
Hmm.
tried to run for the Senate. She lost a primary, and then she ran up running on a third party in 1918, and she finished third. And she left Congress at that point. And she didn't stop. After though she left Congress, she didn't stop her important efforts or the causes that she really believed in. She lobbied for a number of pacifist organizations. She tried to urge Congress and urge a number of people to pass a constitutional amendment banning child labor. And then
Hmm.
in 1937, she went out and spoke against Franklin Roosevelt's policies to help arm the British and give the British Army supplies as they were
Okay.
going to war against Germany.
Hmm.
This is the sort of the beginning of World War II. And the
Right.
U.S. did not officially enter World War II at this point, but they were
Hmm.
giving supplies and aid to the Allies to help fight the Germans, to help fight the
Which,
Nazis.
this is interesting because just sort of the way you describe her, it sounds like she would be extremely supportive of most of FDR's other policies.
Yeah, so a lot of like the social welfare and stuff, she would absolutely be, and I'd have to go back and double check, but she would probably support quite a bit of that. And I'd love to go back and see, how she was speaking on a lot of that. But the name she made for herself was in pacifism,
Right.
and just being, against war at all costs. She wound up testifying in front of a bunch of congressional committees, against all of this. And as it became clear that that wasn't working, she said to herself, as Nazi Germany was taking more and more control, as the United States looked like they might be, inching closer to war.
Hmm.
She said, you know what? The best way for me to help my cause, the best way to help me to for me to help my goal of achieving pacifism in the world is to run for Congress again. And
I
that's
was gonna say,
exactly what she
I
did.
remembered you saying earlier that she was a two-term
I
congresswoman.
was I
Maybe
was hoping you were going
spoilers.
to bring that up.
Maybe
Yeah, so
spoilers.
yeah, well she again, she won from 1917 to 1919. She was in Congress. She left for a number of years, and then she runs again. She beats an anti-Semite in the primary and a former representative in the 1940 general election, and she
Wow.
winds up taking office again January 3rd, 1941.
Wow. Like, granted, I'm not familiar with a ton of people over the course of, congressional history, but I can't think of another
Right.
person who served two terms 25 or so years apart.
Yeah, it's it does happen from time to time where people will like lose an election and then just run again, the next time,
Right,
next time
absolutely.
there's right like that. That happens, semi frequently. I 100% with you on that one. It is incredibly rare to see somebody, um, you know, lose an election, or I guess not run for election in her case, then just not serve in government for that long, and then go back and do it. And
Right.
maybe you'll see somebody like serve in a cabinet or it's wild that she just took all that time basically as an activist,
Yeah.
kind of during the interwar period, and then she said, you know what, I want to run again. I think this is the best way to do it. And she got elected. It wasn't just that she ran to make a point, she ran and got herself elected, which
Yeah.
is awesome. And so she wins January 3rd, 1941. Gavin, what else happens in 1941?
1941. Hmm. I don't think that's Pearl Harbor. I don't. That's later. Um, unless I'm wrong. Is it Pearl Harbor?
It is Pearl Harbor, yes.
Oh, okay.
December 7th, 1941, the day that will live in infamy.
Like, I remembered the date, but I couldn't. I for some reason I was thinking it was 42,
Yeah,
but
again, it's very late.
it's
It's
December,
December.
so it's like,
Yeah, December 1941. So it's absolutely, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it came in 1942. But no, 1941 is when Pearl Harbor happens. That is December 7th. The next day Franklin Roosevelt goes, he gives his address to Congress, he gives
Mm-hmm.
the day that will live in infamy speech, and there's a vote taken to go to war. Now, Gavin, how many of the Rankin goes and she's serving in the House of Representatives at this
Right.
point, and we talked before how there was 50 members of the House of Representatives as well as 6 senators that voted against going to war in World War One. How many of the 82 senators that took a vote to go to war in World War II, how many of those senators voted no?
I'm gonna guess none of them.
0.
Yeah.
How many of the 389 representatives voted against going to war?
I'm gonna guess one.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Out of the entire Congress, Jeannette Rankin was the only one to vote no on going to war in World War II. She voted no to go to war in World War One. She voted no to go to war in World War II, and people were outraged. Other representatives went to her and asked her to either change her vote to a yes or to change her vote and just abstain. So that way it would be a
Right.
unanimous decision. The United States would be, you know, you know, strongly go to war. And many people can be anti-war. We are talking about the Nazis in this particular case,
Right. Of course.
like the literal Nazis in this decision. People were furious as after the vote was taken. She was hounded by reporters. She had to hide in a telephone booth to until Capitol Police were able to escort her away after a little while. She got a whole bunch of telegrams from people, one of which was her brother saying Montana is 100% against you.
Well,
She wound up
that is how representative democracy works sometimes.
right. It is how it works. She gave a quote. Another quote. As a woman, I can't go to war, and I refuse to send anyone else. And I think,
And that's fair. I understand that standpoint.
right, exactly. And there was a writer for this newspaper called the Kansas Emporia Gazette. That sort of I think sums up my feelings. Again, we are I am to briefly talk about my own politics. I don't like war. Not exactly my favorite thing.
Right.
Um, However, we are
However,
talking
I,
about
I was gonna say
something.
I would like to very much point out that this podcast is very staunchly anti-Nazi. Uh,
Yes, right. We are very much anti, and so it is one of those things where everybody has different lines that they draw, and I'll tell you what, my line, Nazis are somewhere beyond that line, quite a bit beyond that line
right.
actually.
Yeah.
And so I think this writer really sums up kind of my feelings on all of this. And this was written shortly after she took that vote. Probably 100 men in Congress would have liked to do what she did. None of them had the courage to do it. The Gazette entirely disagrees with the wisdom of her position, but Lord, it was a brave thing. And its bravery some way discounted its folly. When, in 100 years from now, courage, sheer courage based upon moral indignation, is celebrated in this country, the name of Jeannette Rankin, who stood firm in folly for her faith, will be written in monumental bronze, not for what she did, but for the way she did it. And I think that's kind of the way I would, like to sum it up. Hey, man, go to war against Nazis. Like that is, I am all for that. But damn it, if you're going to be against going to war, then stand firm in that
Right.
position. And that's exactly what she did. And she was acutely aware of her status as the first woman in Congress, and she felt it was her duty as a woman to be
Mm-hmm.
anti-war, to really uphold that position. There was a few women in Congress at this time, but there was not many,
Mm-hmm.
and she wanted to really stake out that position as somebody that had an opportunity to vote.
Well,
She
so
knew. Yeah, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Mine is sort of moving us a little more toward modern American history.
Well, go. Yeah. So, what is that? With modern
So,
American history?
because I know, and I know, I don't remember the name of the person, but it's like almost sort of the opposite, or like it starts off very similar, but ends off kind of oppositely for the vote for like the congressional vote to go to war with Iraq, where it's
Yes.
like now today there was a single person that voted no, whereas
Yes. I believe
unlike
that was
voting,
Afghanistan.
I don't remember which, but there was a single person and whose name I don't know, but at the time, I'm sure this person was hounded just as much uh, as she was. But nowadays, it's like at least the war with Iraq is now like universally, even by people who voted yes at the time, seen as like we should not have done that.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where with the war in Iraq, 90% of people were for the war at the time, but damn it, the only people you ever talk to are the 10% that say I was against that war even at the time.
Right.
She was so the woman you're referring to is a woman named um, Barbara Lee, and
Yes.
she voted against. I believe it looks like you. I think you actually may have been right. Against. Oh no, Chris is only one to vote against. This happened in 2001, so this would have been for the Iraq War or
Yeah.
the Afghanistan War.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, because that came first. So
Right.
yeah, the only person voting against was Barbara Lee, who is still in Congress to this
Yep.
day. So unlike Rankin, who at this point after she took that vote, she immediately knew her
Oh,
political career was
yeah, I'm
over.
sure.
Yeah, Barbara Lee, still in Congress. So go Barbara Lee. I know very little else about you, but yeah, I do remember hearing that. Um, but yeah, switching back to Rankin, real quick, she knew, at this point her political career was over. A couple of days later, the United States took a vote to go to war against Germany
Hmm.
and Italy, and she abstained from that. And I suppose that after all that talk about Nazis, we should clarify that first vote she took was to go to war against Japan
Ah,
after the
okay.
bombing specifically of Pearl Harbor. So
That makes sense.
do with that what you will, but everybody was well aware of what was going on in the world in 1941. Going to war against one was going to war against all.
Interesting. So I'm kind of curious as to her thought process for abstaining from the second two, because if she already doomed her political career for voting no on the first one, why not just bite the bullet and do the other two?
I was thinking that same thing. Like, why? She has made it abundantly clear that she wants to stay out of war. Why not? Why not continue? And I don't have a great answer to that. I don't have you know, it could well be that she felt that she had made her point and she now, would capitulate and say, okay, I've made my point about being anti-war. I voiced my opposition. I
Hmm.
will now I will let these other ones pass, unanimously just to give them, more of an air of, you know, solidarity. That's a good question. And I'd love to know exactly why, she did that. But that is something that I came across and I didn't have a great answer as I was kind of researching this.
Okay.
So, asked years later if she regretted it, if she had second thoughts, she said, "Never. If you're against war, you're against war, regardless of what happens. It's a wrong method of trying to settle a dispute." And once again, there are limits to that. I am pro U.S. Beating Japan and Germany in World War II, but damn it, I can respect somebody that is going to go to that lengths to support that position, even when there is literally nobody else standing with her.
Right, and the justification that she gave is one that like makes so much sense, but that I hadn't even thought about. Where it's like,
Hmm.
well, yeah, of course. Like looking back at it, of course, if women had only been able to vote for like 20 years, we weren't sending them to war in World War II. You
Right,
know,
exactly.
so that's I really understand her point, but like you said, not quite sure if I would personally have taken that same vote.
It's right. It's kind of the old saying, you could go grab a beer with that person. You don't agree with them and everything, but but damn it, that is something that I think is notable. Even if I wouldn't do the same thing. Um, as I mentioned, her political career at that point was functionally over. She served out the remainder of her term. She did not run for reelection. She spent the rest of her life traveling around the world. She spent some time in India, kind of reading the teachings of Gandhi, and she continued once again to promote pacifism. Very notably, she actually gave speeches and tried to work against the Vietnam War. And she considered in 1972 mounting a third campaign to go back to Congress in the 70s to once again be that person in Congress that people could look to as the opposition to the Vietnam War. The two problems with that were number one, by the 70s, the Vietnam War was deeply unpopular. So that was almost unnecessary. because there was many people that did feel that way. And number two,
Right.
she was in her 90s and she was starting to
Oh.
face kind of a multitude of health problems.
Yeah.
And the year following in 1973, she wound up dying at age 92.
Gotcha. Hmm.
And as I mentioned before, I think of her as being uh, more memorable for her pacifism, for being the sole vote against going to war with Japan in 1941. That's the way I remember her.
Right.
She wanted to be remembered as the first woman um, in Congress, and more specifically, she gave this quote, which I love this quote. She said the year before, so in 1972, the year before she died, "If I am to be remembered for no other act, I want to be remembered as the only woman who ever voted to give women the right to vote." And I think that's kind of a cool thing. The only woman that ever voted to give women the right to
Yeah.
vote in Congress, as what would eventually become the 19th Amendment was being bandied about. She took a vote for that, and I think that's a really cool and interesting piece of her legacy that just doesn't get told enough. That doesn't we don't know Jeannette Rankin's name, and I'm sure I've pronounced her first name differently a couple of times over the course of this episode because I'm not entirely sure, because it's just not a name that we know. And damn it, I think it's a name that as Americans should be talked about more often.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, Again, and it's like you were saying, sort of at the top of this episode, it's you know I'm sure, like you said just a second ago, though, like, yeah, she said she wanted to be remembered as like the first woman, but it's like with some of the other anti-war stuff, that's almost like incidental, you know.
Hmm.
It's like it's not like that's all she was. It's not like you know I pay relatively close attention to you know current American politics, but I could not name more than like 20% maybe of representatives in the House. Most of them take votes and just kind of do whatever. But that she made it a point to not do that
Yeah, like one thing
because
I
I
think
bet
that's
it would have been so easy for her to have just been the first woman and then just kind of keep her head down and go with the flow, because that's what most junior Congress people do. You know.
hmm and it's definitely in kind of today's day and age. And I don't know how new this is. As somebody that's only 20, it seems like it's kind of a newer thing, sort of like the celebrity politician, the person that gets elected, and they seem to have more of a brand going on TV, going on Twitter, um, than like legislating.
Right.
And she was sort of the exact opposite. She would, she served her terms in Congress, and then she got out and she was still fighting those same fights. She wasn't a representative at that point, but she was still fighting for those same causes for the remainder of her life. If she could be in Congress and make her point known, that was great. But when she wasn't in Congress, she still was able to, she still wanted to fight for those causes that she cared about. And so I couldn't agree more. She was a great representative. Um, Absent her, her specific views on things, she did the work of being in Congress, and caring about her beliefs just masterfully over the course of her life.
Yeah, and it's also not there are plenty of Congress people who retire from Congress who then become lobbyists today. However, frequently they lobby for things that like they just do for the money, because you can make way more money as a lobbyist than you can
Oh,
as
right,
an
they're
actual congressperson.
right, they're
Uh,
sellouts, and like it's hard to entirely blame them because like you make a lot of money. So,
right, but it's like that's not evidently and I'm sure you could still make a fair amount of money as a lobbyist back then at the time as well. Uh,
mhm.
but you know, a lot of these people probably just get hired because they know how the system actually works and would be more effective than people who had not been Congress people, regardless of if they really believe in what they're now lobbying for. Whereas, you know, Jeanette Rankin, clearly she just went and kept fighting the same fight that she did in Congress.
I, absolutely, and that's and that is part of why. I wanted to make sure I highlighted. I was going through a lot of different names as I was trying to figure out who I wanted to talk about for this episode. And part of what I've tried to do during my couple takes the wheel episodes is pick people that are interesting for like a number of different reasons.
Yeah,
And it sort of came to me a couple hours before recording, like, oh, you know what, Jeannette Rankin is, that is someone that absolutely fits this bill. And so yeah, that is the kind of the story of the first woman federal office holder in United States history.
that's really awesome. Thank you, Mike, for teaching me again for the third time about some really interesting. This time, not really local. The previous two have been somewhat local.
Right. Well,
For
not
me,
local anymore. I mean, you're in California now, so
right. But the first one, there was a town nearby where I grew up named after the person. The second one was a person who was famous in the central New York area where I am broadly from.
yes.
But here it's like I've never actually been to Montana, actually. Uh, so, um, but no, all three of these have been really great, and I cannot wait for the next time that we get to let you take the wheel again.
Yeah, the next time you move cross country, I'll be sure to have something else to look forward to. But this has been episode 37 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. We'll be back next week with one of our typical episodes where Gavin will have something sciencey for us to talk about. But until then, take care, everybody, and we'll see you next Wednesday.